Love is beautiful. Love is endless. Love is all around. And sometimes, love lands you straight in jail, whether or not you deserve it. In 2000, Sarah Jo Pender was in love with the wrong guy, hanging with the wrong crowd. Bad decisions were made, and then, two cold-blooded murders. Whether Sarah Pender was indeed responsible for the murders is still a mystery, despite the system sentencing her to 110 years in prison. Guilty or innocent, Pender took matters into her own hands and broke out of jail in August 2008, before being recaptured 5 months later thanks to a rerun of America's Most Wanted. This is the story of Sarah Pender's escape from jail. It was the 4th of August 2008, and things were about to change for a certain inmate at Rockville Correctional Facility. 29-year-old Sarah Jo Pender had had enough of her imprisonment. She was ready to get out and start all over again, away from the bloody past, the messy trials, the countless appeals to have the evidence reassessed, away from anyone she knew and everyone who knew her. It was Sarah's point of view that she had already spent enough time behind bars. Sure, the world called her a murderer, a female Charles Manson, but she never strayed away from her version of the events. She was innocent, or at least almost innocent, but there wasn't and never had been any blood on her hands. Sarah Pender was 21 years old in 2000. Pender was a Purdue University dropout. She worked as a secretary. Her dreams of working in a particle accelerator lab or pursuing a career in biochemistry long gone, or at least put on hold. Her life was quite good as it was, especially since she'd met Richard Hull, who worked as a bouncer at a bar. The two of them had quickly fallen in love and moved in together. Pender and Hull shared their apartment with another couple, Andrew Cataldi, 24, and Tricia Nordman, 25. At 21, Pender was already a far cry from the ambitious student she'd once been. Her boyfriend, Richard Hull, had a criminal history that included 6 misdemeanors and 2 felony convictions for auto theft and residential entry. Her roommates, Cataldi and Nordman, were both fugitives with a background in drug dealing and forgery. And Sarah Pender knew her boyfriend Hull and Andrew Cataldi sold drugs from their place, but she didn't really mind. Things were going great, until they weren't. Richard Hull and Andrew Cataldi had a falling out, presumably because Cataldi had failed to include Hull in one of his drug deals. Hull had enough, and because he could not legally purchase firearms due to his criminal record, he allegedly persuaded Sarah Pender to purchase a weapon for him. On the morning of October 24, 2000, Hull and Pender drove to a local hypermarket where Sarah Pender paid for a shotgun and ammunition. What happened next is anybody's guess, despite the fact it all took place 23 years ago. Here's the official version. Richard Hull and Sarah Pender returned home around 11 p.m. that night. Pender headed out for a walk shortly after. Meanwhile, an argument broke out between Hull and Cataldi. The two men physically fought, but their brawl turned into a murder. Hull used the weapon Pender had purchased for him to kill both Andrew Cataldi and his partner, Tricia Nordman. Both of them were dead by the time Sarah Pender returned from her walk. Pender didn't recoil in horror. She didn't call the police. Instead, she helped her boyfriend place the bodies in the back of Hull's truck. The two of them drove away and placed the bodies in a dumpster. Hull was arrested in Noblesville on October 27th, and he confessed to the murders straight away. Pender was arrested the same day. Pender herself faced trial at Marion Superior Court in July 2002, but neither Pender nor Hull testified at the trial. The trial was ruthless, and despite the fact that no DNA evidence was found that linked Pender to the murders, the prosecution was hell-bent on proving her guilt. She was dubbed a master manipulator. The court heard that even though Richard Hull was the one who pulled the trigger, Pender pulled the strings. Larry Sells, the prosecuting attorney, called Sarah Pender the female Charles Manson, claiming her influence over Hull was akin to Manson's influence over his cult. Hull pleaded guilty to avoid trial. He claimed from the start that the murders had been Pender's idea, which further convinced the court. Despite this, Hull never backed his claim, never gave any indication as to why Pender would have wanted Cataldi and Nordman dead, but Hull claimed Pender had admitted her guilt in a letter she'd sent him in May 2001. Sarah Pender was found guilty and sentenced to 110 years in prison on August 22, 2002. And now, 6 years later, on August 4, 2008, she was ready to leave. Efforts to get her out of jail legally had always failed. It hadn't even mattered that Richard Hull himself, in a signed affidavit, had recanted and admitted the letter was a forgery. So Pender used all her resources to get herself out of jail. and back to freedom. Rockville Correctional Facility, Indiana's largest state prison for women, was a medium security prison. But Sarah Jo Pender's escape plan didn't involve intricate machinations anyways. It involved feelings and money. On the morning of August 4, 2008, Pender sat in her cell, patiently waiting for the plan to unfold. Once she was out of her cell, she went to the prison's gymnasium. A change of clothes awaited her, provided by her accomplice, Scott Spittler. Scott Spittler had been a corrections officer at Rockville Correctional Facility for 5 years. He had a wife and kids, but he also had an ongoing sexual relationship with Sarah Pender, whom he thought was an intelligent, sexy woman. Once Pender let him know about her desire to break out of jail, Spittler agreed to help her. But this decision wasn't made entirely out of love. Pender promised him $15,000 if he helped her escape. Spittler just couldn't refuse the money. After Pender changed into civilian clothes, she proceeded to walk to the fueling area. Spittler was there, waiting for her in a van. Pender got into the van and hid under one of the seats. Spittler drove toward the prison gate, knowing surely that the van wouldn't be searched. Spittler drove Pender to one of the facility's parking lots. It was time for the second part of the plan. Jamie Long was waiting for Sarah Jo Pender in a car. Long and Pender had met in 2007 while inmates at the Marion County Jail. The two women formed a close, intimate relationship, with Long even calling Pender her wife. After being released from prison, Long would keep visiting Sarah Pender. It was during one of these visits that the older woman had agreed to help Pender escape. Pender got into Long's car. Relief hit her. She was free and almost safe. Long drove Pender to Indianapolis and gave her $140 before wishing her good luck and dropping her off. Now on her own, Sarah Jo Pender fled Indiana, hoping to find her new beginning somewhere else. Meanwhile, an inmate count revealed that Pender was missing. Authorities acted swiftly, and the prison was immediately put on maximum security lockdown. Surveillance tapes and the guard shack log revealed that Pender had been aided by Spittler, who was arrested the day after the escape on August 5th. Once arrested, Spittler didn't hold back and told investigators about Jamie Long's part in Pender's escape. Long was arrested 2 days later on August 7th. Pender moved to Chicago and managed to get a job as an estimator for a contractor. She used a fake name, Ashley Thompson, and settled as a good, law-abiding citizen in a North Side Chicago neighborhood. Authorities didn't cease their efforts to recapture her. TV show America's Most Wanted ran a feature on Pender in September 2008, a month after her escape. Pender was added to the U.S. Marshals 15 Most Wanted Fugitives list a month later, in October 2008. And perhaps her dream of freedom would have succeeded if not for a rerun of America's Most Wanted in December 2008. After seeing the rerun, one of Pender's, now Thompson's, new neighbors identified her as a fugitive and alerted the Chicago police. And just like that, Pender's apartment was surrounded by the police. The woman didn't resist arrest, but she denied she was Sarah Pender. After her escape, Pender was held in solitary confinement for 5 years. She was allowed to leave her cell for only 2 hours a day. She spent the rest of her time by herself, reading and trying to keep her mental sanity. She was transferred back to Rockville Correctional Facility in 2018. Sarah Pender's story is a controversial one, with many people believing her being convicted for murder is nothing else but a glaring system failure. More shockingly, Larry Sells, the prosecuting attorney who linked her to Charles Manson and worked to see her behind bars for 110 years, now believes Sarah Jo Pender to be innocent. Pender is now 43 years old. According to Larry Sells, justice is long overdue for Sarah Pender. Unfortunately, the legal system has to date failed her, but that grievous error can and should be corrected. Pender has spent most of her time in prison trying to appeal the verdict, and perhaps she will never stop.